When I think back over the past 20 years, what I'm struck by mostly is how much I've learned and how many people I've learned from, many of who are here today. Because, as you heard, this is not the career that I expected. I was drafted into the advocacy army. But this is what happens when you love a child with autism. But there were many more senior officers in the infantry who led the way for me when I had no clue. So thank you, Leanne Carter, Mark Carter, Lauren Ridland, Lisa Siegel, Elise Orlando, Melanie Shaffrin, Ann DeCara, and Bonnie Clark. Bonnie especially. Bonnie was literally the first mom to reach out to me after I had my very first, very scary IEP meeting. And I'll never forget that. That made such a huge impression on me about how important it is for autism mothers to be there to support each other. We really relied on each other back then for knowledge and support, and I'm so glad that I had such wonderful warrior moms to learn from. Debbie Hillebrand, Robin Morris, and of course Karen London from the National Alliance for Autism Research came next. At NAR, I learned the importance of science. I learned to be an advocate and a fighter, and perhaps most importantly, I learned to become a fundraiser. Thank you especially to Bob and Suzanne Wright. Suzanne was an amazing mentor to me and to thousands of moms all over the world. I still hear her in my head all the time. It was Bob and Suzanne who plucked me out of CNBC to help them launch Autism Speaks. As we saw, NBC did a week-long series across all the networks about the autism epidemic, and it was while I was producing that series that I met some of the nation's top scientists, Joe Bucksbaum, Ami Klin, Tom Insel, and they all became important and amazing mentors to me, people whom I've learned so much from over the last 20 years. Okay, so what have I learned? I have learned that science is hard. It is really hard, and it takes a long time. It takes a really long time. And it's very easy for us to become discouraged by science. Now, 20 years into this, it's hard not to wonder whether we've made a meaningful difference. Yes, we have earlier and better diagnosis, and we've learned a tremendous amount about the genomic architecture of autism. And of course, we know that vaccines do not cause autism, but more on that later from Dr. Offit. But 20 years ago, the goal of that NBC series was to shine a bright spotlight on the rising prevalence of what was then a little-known disorder. The series called out the lack of federal funding for autism research and the critical role played by parent advocates who demanded that more be done to help their children. And in the final segment of that series, Bob and Suzanne announced the launch of Autism Speaks. When I rewatched those stories that aired in February 2005, I realized that there were really very few things that I would need to change if we wanted to rerun them. We still lack appropriate federal funding, especially now. And we still rely on parent advocates, and of course on Christ-Snyder, to get the CARES Act reauthorized every 4 years so that there's any federal funding for autism research. 20 years ago, we thought that within 10 years, we'd find maybe 5 or so genes that are associated with autism. I won't tell you who promised me it would be 5 to 10 genes, but he's seated at table 5. But we now know that there are more than 100 genes associated with autism. 20 years ago, Janssen Pharmaceuticals applied to the FDA for approval for the very first autism drug, risperidone, for irritability associated with autism. 20 years later, we only have 2 medications, risperidone and aripiprazole, and neither target the core symptoms of autism. 20 years ago, the best behavioral intervention we had to offer was applied behavior analysis. That is still our best option, although now we take a much more personalized approach to ABA, thanks to the important work of scientists like David Mandel and Connie Cassidy. Years ago, we had just completed the first studies looking at the relationship between vaccines and autism. We now have a mountain of evidence exonerating vaccines, and yet the cacophony drones on in Washington and in the media. 20 years ago, the National Institute for Mental Health spent only $60 million a year on autism research. That amounted to about $66 per autistic person. I remember Cure Autism Now founder John Shestak described that as, that's like dinner at the Olive Garden. Today, the newly reauthorized Autism Cares Act of 2024 has increased federal funding for research, but the scale of resources has never been adequate. The urgency that we felt 20 years ago when Congress first passed the Combating Autism Act of 2006 was squandered. First, by the anti-vaccine madness that made the autism issue toxic for our politicians, and second, by the rise of the neurodiversity movement, which diverted what little research money was available to what I would consider to be lower priority research items. But we did have one thing going for us 20 years ago. 20 years ago, autism was profound autism. Unfortunately, for the past 12 years, autism spectrum disorder has been overly romanticized as a superpower, an alternative way of being, a gift even. For many of our families, including mine, autism is no gift. And this view, this neurodiversity-centered view, has distorted the public perception of autism into something that doesn't really seem so bad. The changes that we made when we collapsed the DSM-4 subtypes of autism into the single diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5 were a huge mistake because people with the most debilitating forms of autism were left behind. Our profoundly autistic children are suffering with intellectual disability, lack of language, inability to care for themselves, seizures, gastrointestinal problems, self-injury, catatonia, I could go on. These individuals make up 27% of the population of people with autism spectrum disorder, but they have had no voice. Over the past 5 years, many of us have worked together to give that voice back to people with profound autism. Jill Escher, Amy Lutz, Lori Ireland, Michael Rosen, John Shestak, Peter Bell, Aaron Lopes, Karen Zucker, Judith Bersidi, Gloria Satriali, Lee Wachtel, Carol Koch, Jillian Leake, Michelle Smigel, Laura Slacken, Tish Durkin, Denise Lombardi, and last but never ever least, Marilyn Simons. Thank you to all of you for advocating for those who cannot participate in policy-making meetings, for those who are not the subject of television sitcoms. Our children rely on us to be their voice, and together we have made great strides in bringing their voices back. And recently, this progress towards recognizing profound autism has been echoed by science, which has now provided biological and genetically defined evidence of biological and genetically defined subtypes, including profound autism. Just last month, at the International Society for Autism Research annual meeting in Seattle, we saw multiple biological models confirming subtypes of autism. We saw genetically defined subtypes, imaging subtypes, eye tracking subtypes, language subtypes, even subtyping based on organoid size. Studies showed that there were, mostly there were 2 subtypes, or in some cases 3 clear biological subtypes, which were described in one of those presentations as profound autism, autism and mild autism. And doesn't this harken back to classic autism, PDD-NOS, and Asperger's syndrome, as we had in DSM-4? We have come full circle, and now it is time for the DSM-6 committee to recognize this biology, to remedy its error, and to bring back at least 3 defined autism subtypes so that the interventions and infrastructure can be developed and designed to meet the needs of these very different and diverse populations. And so I feel that in 2025, as in 2005, we find ourselves at a crossroads. Profound autism is having a moment. Regardless of your views on the current administration, it is shining a bright spotlight on a population of individuals who for the past decade have been left in the dark, and it's about time. But it's critical to focus that light on the science that matters. And yet across the board, the scientific infrastructure of this country is being decimated, with universities losing funding and massive cuts at the NIH. Science is literally under siege. And the timing in the autism community could not be worse. As we saw at INSTAR, we are finally at a point in autism science where we are moving beyond descriptive studies and transitioning from discovery to rescue. Gene editing, correcting genetic mutations, small molecule therapeutics, brain organoid modeling, these are now the reality. The questions are no longer ifs, but hows and whens. How do we deliver therapeutics in the brain? How do we dose? A presentation at INSTAR that really struck me was focused on whether to inject the gene-correcting virus vectors through a borehole directly in the brain or through a lumbar puncture. I mean, this is the science that just 5 years ago sounded like science fiction. And yet, we are seeing actual children's genetic abnormalities remedied by a CRISPR-based gene editing. And our children with monogenic forms of autism and idiopathic forms of autism won't be far behind. From a purely scientific standpoint, I am more hopeful now than I have been in years. Looking back, I'm very proud of what the Autism Science Foundation has accomplished and the important role it has played in the autism science ecosystem. From our start, we always focused on funding early career scientists and on enticing the best and the brightest minds to study autism. And many of our current top scientists are the pre- and postdocs that ASF funded 15 years ago. They are no longer students. They are now making very meaningful contributions, improving our children's language acquisition, making mouse models, and testing novel interventions. Their work is having a direct impact on the lives of people with autism. In addition to focusing on the next generation of scientists, we are also focused on the next generation of people with autism. You heard earlier about our expansion of the Baby Siblings Research Consortium to add a new cohort of the children of unaffected siblings through our Next Gen SIBS project. It was through work that ASF funded that we learned that just like siblings, these children, the nieces and nephews of people with autism, are also at increased risk. And so now we are building out an international network so that those infants can be tracked from birth and directed to early intervention services, the first warning signs of autism. It was also the Autism Science Foundation that led the research to prove the existence of the female protective effect via our Autism Sisters project. We learned that despite the 4-to-1 male to female ratio in diagnosis, being male actually doesn't confer risk for autism, but rather being female confers resilience. Now our hope is to be able to harness whatever it is that is protecting females and use it to prevent autism in both boys and girls. This work is now continuing at the NIH. I hope it was continuing at the NIH, but fortunately it's also continuing at the Science Foundation. But this is exactly the type of high-risk, high-reward work that we like to focus on. It's what we at the Autism Science Foundation are able to do that the NIH can't do. Respond quickly to new hypotheses, act nimbly, get funds out the door in weeks, not years. We also make sure to share the latest findings directly with families through our days of learning, our website, social media, and especially Alicia's award-winning weekly podcast, so that change can happen at the point of care. And now, more than ever, we will continue to push for better science-based treatments and better national policies to support research and to support individuals with autism and their caregivers directly. I want to close by thanking my family who's here today. My mom, as you heard, is the original advocate back in the 1970s, dragging me to the Camp Venture walkathons, which I went to because they had chocolate milk. My dad wanted so much to be here, but he wasn't able to. I try not to judge people, but if I were to judge people, it would be based on how nice they are to Jody and based on how much Jody loves them. And there's no one who loves Jody more than my dad. According to that metric, he is the best person on the earth. I also want to thank Linda Singer and Michael Lewis, my in-laws. Thank you for all your support, for coming to every walk, every ride, every lunch, every event. My brother Rob is here, and my two sisters-in-law, Liz and Angela. Thank you for your support over the years, for using your voices. But thank you especially to Dan. You've been behind me all the way, every day, and I'm only able to do this work because you encourage me and you believe in me. I am so grateful to you, and I am so grateful that you are our daughter's father. And thank you to both of my girls, Lauren, who wanted to be here but unfortunately couldn't. She represents the next generation of fierce advocates, and we're in very good shape. And I also want to thank Jody. Jody is just a pure angel. And I wish that she could be here today to see what she started and what we have collectively accomplished in her name.